What's up guys, Agent here again with another build video, and today we're going to be going over the Magicka Necromancer. And things changed very quickly for Magicka Necromancers over the course of just a single patch. And elsewhere, Magicka Necromancers were pretty much close to the bottom alongside Magicka Wardens, but now, in Scalebreaker, they are among the top Magicka DPS specs in the game right now, up there with Magicka Wardens as well as Magicka DKs. So, Necromancers, in just a single patch, have become one of the top Magicka DPS, and this isn't because of any changes that were made necessarily to their own abilities. Necromancers were actually fairly untouched in the Scalebreaker patch. It was actually due to just generic sort of in-game changes across multiple dots. Mainly the single target dot meta has really highly improved just DPS across the board for a lot of classes, not so much for other classes, but it really impacted Magicka Wardens and Magicka Necromancers the most, mainly because other class AoEs were reduced in strength, therefore basically lowering their DPS a little bit while increasing the Necromancer and Magicka Wardens DPS, resulting in Wardens and Necromancers pushing ahead of the pack here. So just like the rest of our build videos, we'll be going over gear, skills, attributes, basically everything you need to know to recreate this build yourself. We'll talk a little bit about some alternative sets that you might want to wear in place of some other sets here. And then of course we'll talk about the rotation and then go over a 200 million dummy parse so you guys get an idea of how the rotation actually plays out, as well as get a good point of comparison to kind of bring to the table across the other Magicka classes. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started here first with our gear. So again, this is just one of many potential setups here, and I will be discussing some of the other set options in a little bit here. But first, starting off with Monster Helm sets. If you're able to stay within melee range, that 8 meter radius for Zaan, Zaan is going to be the strongest Monster Helm set for Magicka DPS. If you can't get within melee range for Zaan, then you do need to kind of pick out other options here. Usually it'll be two different one-piece Monster Helm sets with spell crit, but for melee range and if the boss isn't jumping around too much, you can just go with Zaan, which is still by far the strongest Magicka DPS helmet in the game. Other monster helm sets that you might want to consider picking up here, and of course it's going to vary depending on the situation. Rothar is very great for AoE fights here. It's very similar to Zaan in that it has an 8 meter radius, but instead of just hitting one enemy, it hits all enemies within that 8 meter radius. So very powerful for AoE, and it's also the strongest Monster Helm set for base game users. So if you don't have access to Skeletal or Peak in order to get Zaan, then Rothar is going to be your next best option. Ilambris is actually not terrible to use on a Necromancer because you do have some sources of shock damage in the Necromancer's toolkit, but it does have its limitations, mainly the fact that it's a smaller radius, only 4 meters, and it's a static sort of effect. So if the boss moves out of your meteor shower, then it doesn't really do any damage. So it is possible to run Ilambris fairly effectively on a Magicka Necromancer, but other Monster Helm sets are going to be a little bit stronger. In terms of ranged Monster Helm sets, though, Ilambris is definitely a solid option. Next, did I skip over? Yes, we have Slimecraw here, which basically gives you Minor Berserk at all times. Now, Minor Berserk normally comes from Comet Prayer, which is a buff from your healers. Obviously, if you cannot depend on your healers to get you good Minor Berserk uptime, for example, there are some trials where it's a little bit challenging to get good Minor Berserk uptime. Asylum Hard Mode is one that comes to mind here. Slimecraw really stands out. Minor Berserk is a very powerful buff, so you definitely want to have that active at all times. So really good for progression style stuff, as well as the situations where you might not be getting Minor Berserk from your healer. Moving on from there, you do have Valkyn's Skoria, which is probably the weakest out of all 4 Monster Helm sets we're going to be discussing here. It just gives max health for the one piece, so it doesn't really help out your overall DPS. The proc itself is fairly weak overall. And so in terms of ranged Monster Helm options, Ilambris or running 2 one-piece crit sets is going to be better, generally speaking. And that's pretty much it for Monster Helm sets. One Monster Helm set I do want to really quickly give a shout out to is Iceheart, mainly because it is one of the few pieces with one-piece spell crit, but also because it's really good for sort of progression style guilds. It gives you a pretty good damage shield. The damage is pretty meh, it's not that great, but you're really there for the damage shield, which helps out your survivability. Really strong for Magicka DPS if you're starting to progress through content. Next, going over a couple of sets here. Starting off with our body set, I'm running Burning Spellweave, which comes from City of Ash. I actually tried out quite a few options as a Magicka Necromancer. Burning Spellweave just ends up being one of the better options, one of the best options in fact, tied pretty much neck and neck with Mother's Sorrow. Now why aren't we running Mother's Sorrow? Well, Magicka Necromancers get additional crit chance in Execute, and so Mother's Sorrow for that last 25% of the boss fight isn't going to be very powerful. That being said, the first 75% of the boss fight, Mother Sorrow is still going to be very powerful. And so this sort of last execute sort of thing where you don't need the Mother Sorrow, essentially you lose that 5 piece, that sort of balances out a little bit here. And so Burning Spellweave and Mother Sorrow, in my experiences, have pulled pretty neck and neck in terms of my testing here. So in terms of other body sets to run here, I tried a few options, one of them being Elemental Succession. This is on the Scalebreaker PTS, so the uptime on Elemental Succession is not quite as high as it should be on live. So my parse here was on the lower end, but on live it should be a little bit higher. But Elemental Succession is a potentially good option because pretty much all of your abilities do include Flame Shock or Frost damage. The only abilities that do not are going to be Soul Trap and Degeneration. So generally speaking, Succession is going to be a fairly strong set. It comes from Maelstrom Arena, so it's not tradable. But because you're going for just straight up armor, you could also go front bar if you'd like. You could just run Maelstrom Arena on normal in order to farm for the set rather than having to go through vet. Kind of depends if you want to farm Maelstrom weapons as well while you're trying to get this set here. Another set I tried was False God's Devotion. Not that great compared to Burning Spellweave or Mother's Sorrow, but still pretty decent. The cost reduction is really the main reason why you would use False God's Devotion, but Magicka DPS Sustain is pretty decent with Degeneration, plus you have a Necromancer ability Siphon, which returns Magicka back, so not really all that needed. Of course, Mother's Sorrow, I already talked about that. It's a pretty good strong body set there. The other set I tried was Spell Strategist. So this is a Cyrodiil set, so you can just go into Cyrodiil, get rewards for the worthy, and try to get this set that way. Or you can just buy straight off of guild traders from other people who already have gotten this set. Pretty decent overall, but generally speaking, it was a little bit weaker than Burning Spellweave and Mother Sorrow as the body set here. The front bar set that I used was Perfected Siroria, which comes from Cloud Rest. So Siroria is very strong when it comes to static fights, fights where you're able to do stack and burns, fights where you don't necessarily need to play around with mechanics too much. Really, really powerful there. It gives you very great spell damage bonuses here. This is a front bar set here because it did fix the bug where it wouldn't apply on your back bar. Now it does. That being said, Siroria is not going to be great for those mobile fights when you need to move around, Asylum, potentially Cloud Rest. It does take a little bit of micromanagement to make sure that if you are running Siroria on the front bar that you don't end up losing all your stacks at an opportune moment. So Siroria is not going to be the best set as a front bar set, depending on your specific situation. Sets that would potentially replace Siroria would be Burning Spellweave, Elemental Succession. Those are probably going to be the two ones that I recommend the most here. You could run Mother's Sorrow instead. There are a couple of other sets though that might be better fits there. In terms of other dungeon sets, there really aren't too many here that I would recommend. No, not really. Zen's Redress potentially as a front bar set if you're kind of playing a support role. Basically, your light attacks apply a debuff on enemies for 20 seconds, and while they have the debuff, they can take an additional 1% more damage for each damage over time effect you've placed on them, up to 5%. So this is more of a group-oriented sort of support set rather than a personal DPS set. Your DPS will be lower with Zen's Redress, but you're giving the group additional DPS, so that's kind of the trade-off that you're making there with Zen's. But really the only other set I'd probably potentially consider picking up would be Julianos, which is a crafted set from Hrothgar, 6 traits. Pretty easy, pretty powerful beginner set there. But pretty much all the sets that I've already covered would be the sets that I would recommend picking up as a Magicka Necromancer. There might be a few other niche uses, so for example Necropotence might be a decent option for those of you guys who are able to maintain your skeletal mage. Where is it? Necropotence. This basically gives you a lot of max magicka. Going to be a little bit weaker than the other sets just because spell crit is a lot more important, but it is a potential option to run. It does require you to basically maintain your skeletal mage up the whole time, so not exactly something that I would necessarily recommend on a Magicka Necromancer. It's not very consistent if you're not able to maintain that skeletal mage the whole time. Then our back bar, just the Maelstrom Inferno staff. Nothing's changed with the Maelstrom Inferno staff. They're still the best back bar staff here. Infused with a weapon damage enchant. For our front bar, create an enchant, flame damage, and then you can either go precise or infused. The higher your DPS is, the more DPS you'll get out of precise compared to infused. You can think of it this way: infused is a fixed bonus to your DPS, while precise is sort of a relative increase to your DPS. So the higher your overall DPS, the higher that relative increase. And so once you get past maybe around 60k DPS or so, precise ends up beating out infused. For jewelry traits and enchants, all spell damage enchants, all bloodthirsty. You could go with infused as well, or arcane, so you have 3 options when it comes to jewelry traits. Just kind of pick whichever one you want. Arcane is still plenty strong on Magicka DPS. You don't necessarily need to transmute to bloodthirsty or infused, but bloodthirsty is going to give you the best results. For armor, divines with max Magicka enchants across the board, and we are going 5-1-1, so you do want to have 1 heavy and 1 medium piece. Typically speaking, that'll come from your monster helm sets here. Going over our character sheet next, I am a Dark Elf. Dark Elves are going to be one of the best races for Magicka DPS. The absolute best would be High Elves. They get 2000 max Magicka and 258 additional spell damage. Dark Elves get 1875 Magicka and stamina and 258 additional spell and weapon damage, kind of giving them a good option if you want to flip-flop between Magicka DPS and stamina DPS. Other races include Bretons, which get very good sustain bonuses. They get 2000 max Magicka, but they don't get any additional spell damage. Instead, they get 100 Magicka regen and 7% cost reduction to all Magicka abilities. So Bretons are really strong in that sustain department, but your overall DPS ceiling will end up being lower just because your max spell damage is going to end up being lower overall. Finally, if you kind of want to get into kind of a jack of all trades sort of build here, so for example, you might want to do stamina DPS, you might want to be a support role, consider the Khajiits. Khajiits get 825 max Magicka health and stamina. They get 85 Magicka regen and stamina regen, and 100 health regen. They also get 10% additional critical healing done and critical damage done, giving them a very good mix across the board. Not necessarily going to be the best DPS or the best tank or the best healer, but you'll be very good at each of those roles. Hence, a jack of all trades build, not necessarily the master build. Next, in terms of attributes, all of our points are going into Magicka here. Again, sustain for Magicka DPS has gone pretty high, especially with Magicka Necromancers between Siphon and Degeneration, and so you don't necessarily need to run Clockwork Citrus Fillet or Witchman's Potent Brew anymore. You could just run Blue Food and you'd be able to sustain on most fights in the game, just a full light attack rotation. Of course, if you do need additional sustain, you can swap out the back bar enchant from a weapon damage to absorb Magicka Glyph, or you can just run Clockwork Citrus Fillet or Witchman's Potent Brew. Necromancers do get some additional health, so you do kind of offset that loss of max health from switching to resustain food compared to buy stat food. So running buy stat food, you should not need any additional points into health here. 64 into Magicka is pretty much all you need. For Mundus, we are using the Shadow Mundus, nothing has changed there, and then we are using Parse Food, Ice Cream, in order to get an accurate comparison across the various classes. So this is just to kind of equalize everything between all the different classes, so we can get an accurate comparison between classes, at least across my channel. Again, an actual raid scenario, you'd probably be using something like Buy Stat Food, or if you need to sustain Clockwork Citrus Fillet, or Clockwork Citrus Fillet, or Witchmother's Potent Brew. Next, moving to our skill bars, we have Stalking and Blastbones, Scalding Rune, Avid Boneyard, Skeletal Arcanist, Mystic Siphon, Glacial Colossus. On our back bar, we have Soul Trap, Flame Reach, Unstable Wall of Fire, Barbed Trap. You can replace this with Lightweight Beast Trap if you don't have access to the Sigil Order line and you can't be within melee range. Or you can replace this with the Sigil Order line, so Lightweight Beast Trap gives you 10 seconds of the Minor Force. Or if you have access to it, you can run Channel Acceleration instead for the Minor Force if you can't play within melee range. Obviously, Barbed Trap would be the best option, but it does require you to be within that melee range in order to get it off. And then Degeneration, and then we have Glacial Colossus again on our back bar here. If you ever need a shield, just replace one of your dots. Doesn't really matter which one. I'd probably say out of all of them, the one that I would probably swap out would be Flame Reach or Scalding Rune here. You could also swap out Mystic Siphon, but you would lose some sustain overall. And you also lose that additional damage done bonus while you have it slotted. So I wouldn't recommend taking off Mystic Siphon. I'd probably just do Scalding Rune if you need a shield for whatever reason. Next, going over our CP points. CP cap is still 810, which gives us 270 CPs across each of our different constellation colors here. So starting off with our green CPs, the only thing that I say you must have is going to be 100 into Arcanist. The remaining points, you can kind of split up however you'd like. So if you don't need the heavy attack to sustain your rotation, there's no point in putting this many points into Tenacity, and you can take those out and shift them into other nodes. So I have 75 Tenacity, 31 Shadow Ward, 31 Tumbling, and 33 Warlord, but again, you can kind of split it up however you'd like. I personally don't usually put this many points in Tenacity, but it's always nice to have that sort of backup sustain option there. For our blue CPs, I do want to point out this is assuming that you have all your debuff active, so this would be Alkosh, Infused Thorax Crusher, Minor Breach, Major Breach, the whole works there. So if you are missing any of those debuffs, for example, you might be running just a plain Infused Crusher, or you're not anticipating very good uptimes on your debuffs, shift some points out of your other nodes and put them in a Spell Erosion. That way you can get up to the penetration cap. So for example, Elfborn you can drop down to 56, LE Expert can also be dropped down to 56, those are the next jump points. Next we have Master at Arms, you can drop down to 40 if you'd like, Staff Expert can be dropped down to 12 or 9. Thaumaturge, I would say stick at 75. There was a buff to off-balance uptime, so it's now 7 seconds with a 20-second cooldown, so 7 out of 20. And so Thaumaturge, along with the increase in the overall dot meta, is very strong, so you just want to get 75 Thaumaturge for the Exploiter passive here. Otherwise, you have 10 Spell Erosion, 64 LE Expert, 61 Elfborn, 44 Master at Arms, and 16 into Staff Expert. Finally, our red CPs. This is taking a kind of balanced approach to overall CPs, so pretty good mitigation across the board, but you're not necessarily going to maximize mitigation against any single piece of content. 81 Ironclad, 61 Thick-Skinned, and 64 in both Hardy and Elemental Defender. So that pretty much covers all the build information. So now let's go ahead and talk about the rotation on a 6 million dummy, and then we'll move on to 20 million dummy so you guys can see the rotation in a full parse. So generally speaking, a lot of dots to maintain here. So unlike in elsewhere where our rotation was really centered around blasting, stalking Blastbones, now it's really just maintain all your dots as best you can. And then you use Scalding Rune kind of in between dots. Now Scalding Rune does have a arm time, so you do have to use one ability between casts of Scalding Rune. But if you are in a position where none of your dots are about to run out very quickly, you can just use Scalding Rune and recast that a little bit early. You also have Stalking Blastbones as well, so you'll see in this rotation here that it is a dynamic rotation. So we're not really going to be following any sort of set rotation. We're just going to be following along with what dots need to be renewed. In terms of which dots to prioritize, Unstable Blockade is your first dot, followed by Degeneration, and then Soul Trap. Barbed Trap also fits there in something you want to prioritize for the minor force uptime. And then from there you have Flame Reach, Scalding Rune, and then Unnerving Boneyard and Siphon. I think out of all of them, I'd probably say try to keep out Boneyard as best you can, followed by Flame Reach. Scalding Rune is something that you can re-up or let run out. Skeletal Arcanist is decent. You don't necessarily need to keep it up the whole time, but it is a pretty decent dot, so try to keep it up if you can. The Mystic Siphon is pretty decent as well, but you do need to keep in mind that you need a corpse in order to use it, so that's why we have Blastbones here. So here's an example of what I mean when we say we have a dynamic rotation. So you can see here that I'm basically bar swapping and just prioritizing my various dots here. Just re-upping my dots when they go out. So again, it's a very dynamic rotation. You're gonna really be taking a look at your dots when they're running out, and then just going from there. One of the things that I will mention here is that when you use Avid Boneyard, try to center it closer to yourself because the synergy is based on the center of the cast rather than the entire area. So you just want to make sure that center of your circle here is centered on you. So for example, if we decide to go here, you can see that I am within the area, but once you have to let it run out for 20 seconds. But if you're basically outside of these sort of graveyards, these little gravestones, you will not actually be able to get the synergy. So just try to keep it a little bit centered closer to you than you normally would. And then Siphon does require that corpse. That's why we're using Blastbones here. Basically, when you have any downtimes between applying dots, just use Scalding Rune and Blastbones. Just kind of alternate between the two of them. So it's better if you guys actually see it on an actual raid dummy to kind of get an idea of just how dynamic and how chaotic this rotation actually can become. Again, we're using the 21 million dummy raid parse here just because it normalizes all the buffs across all the classes, so that way we can get an accurate comparison between classes, at least on my channel. So if you want to compare me to Lyco, that's not even a comparison. Lyco is obviously going to be much better than me. So just use this parse to compare it across my builds, not necessarily other people's builds, because obviously we have to take into consideration things like lag, player skill, etc. And again, we are using the sustain food, ghastly eyeball, just so we can normalize comparisons, just sort of minimize the variation between the classes here. So let's go ahead and get started here with our 21 million dummy raid parse. You can see here, very chaotic right off the bat. In terms of what bar you want to use Colossus on, honestly, it doesn't really matter too much. Please let me use my Colossus. See here that even though my Scalding Rune didn't run out, there was really no other dot that needed to be renewed, and so I just used Scalding Rune there. On my back bar, I'm just going to use my Colossus on my back bar. Again, doesn't really matter what bar you use your Colossus on, as long as you just use it as soon as it's up. And an execute, don't change your rotation at all. We don't have any execute. The Necromancer's execute is just a passive boost to your crit chance. Oops. Doesn't look like this parse is quite as good as my previous parses, but that's okay. Yeah, that parse was not nearly as good as my other parses, but we do have some other parses saved up. So unfortunately, I only hit 82.9k this parse. Let me see if I can identify the reason why. A little bit lower burning Spellweave uptime, but not too much. But I do have some safe parses from other builds that I did want to show you guys as well. So this 85.3k is with Elemental Succession. Again, this should be higher on live because you should have higher uptime. But you can see here that you can get pretty much almost 100% uptime, close to it. It's not going to be 100% exactly. It's going to be closer to about 95 to 90% on Flame Succession and Frost Succession. Shock Succession is going to be a little bit lower just because you're really focusing on getting Deathbolt or Mystic Siphon to proc it. It's a little bit lower overall. So that's Elemental Succession, about 85.3. This one here, I believe, is Burning Spellweave. The other Burning Spellweave parse that I did, which was 87.4. So obviously this is a little bit better than the previous one. So if you can see why this one was bad. It's kind of hard to tell right off the bat here. Stalking Blastbones not critting as much as one. Just generally looks like a little bit lower crit chance overall. Seems to be what really did it here. But that's Burning Spellweave. You can realistically actually expect to pull 87.4. That would be the number that I would use as comparison. So we can see that's pretty much beating out most Magicka DPS. I think only Magicka DKs and Magicka Wardens would be doing better than this. But again, I'm not as familiar with Magicka Necromancers as I am with Wardens or DKs. This is the, let me see here, this is the Mother Sorrow parse here, so 87.7k. Again, when I was doing testings earlier, Burning Spellweave and Mother Sorrow was pretty much going neck and neck. I think Mother Sorrow would give you more consistent DPS than Burning Spellweave, just because you're a little bit reliant on that proc there for Burning Spellweave, but it's kind of up to you which one you want to go for. Mother Sorrow, at the very least, you can buy off Guild Traders, so it should be faster and easier to obtain than Burning Spellweave. And then this last part here, I believe, was with, let me see here, this is Spell Strategist. Yeah, this is the one with Spell Strategist here. It's a little bit lower, 86.2k. That's, again, mainly because of the fact that in this current meta, we're taking a look more at critical damage rather than just raw spell damage. So you can see our spell damage here is far higher, 49.55 compared to using Mother Sorrow. But our crit chance is a lot higher here with Mother Sorrow compared to on Spell Strategist. And so this is generally speaking going to be a little bit better than just stacking up on spell damage like you would with Spell Strategist. But that's pretty much it for this build video. If you guys have any questions about the build, please feel free to leave them in the comment section below. I'll try to answer them to the best of my ability. Hope you guys found this video informative, and I'll see you guys in the next dungeon.